Actually, I'm surprised by this too. That really doing agriculture, like intensive agriculture, where you might be able to put a tractor out there and really intensifying things, is not suitable for a large amount of the land. Now, I'm not sure exactly how this is calculated. They might be including here some large land areas that we never would have thought were suitable for agriculture. In general, it is true that a lot of the land is not suitable for agriculture. And as we'll talk about in the next chapter, a lot of the land that we think of now as agricultural land maybe shouldn't have been suitable for agriculture, or was only suitable under extreme conditions of putting a lot of fossil fuels into it. So it's just a good reminder here. Now, our textbook tells us that it's actually difficult sometimes to figure out where the line is between horticulture and agriculture. So how much intensification do you have to have before you start calling it agriculture? There's just my feeling is that in agriculture as opposed to, or as in comparison to horticulture, gardening, there's a tendency to concentrate on one core crop. And I get this mostly from the anthropologist Sidney Mintz, but there's been a tendency in the places that develop more intensive agriculture to really start centering your life around what he calls a core carbohydrate. And some of the biggest examples of the world are wheat and rice or potatoes or corn, maize, that have been used basically as the subsistence for whole societies, whole civilizations. There are others that millet and yams and different kinds of there's other things that could go into this category, but these are some of the biggest and most familiar. And what happens in these societies is that the core carbohydrate becomes the same thing as food itself. And you can sometimes see this linguistically as well as on the plate, so that the bulk of your calories are coming from this central dish. I think in this case, we're looking at a dish full of rice. And the central carbohydrate, as carbohydrates often are usually pretty bland, but they can be grown in big varieties. Now, this is different, of course, than the hunter-gatherer diet, which is much more diverse, or even a horticulture diet, which tends to not necessarily center on one thing. Now, when I say it becomes the same as food, so one illustration is that in Korean, for example, the word for rice, pop, is also this word for food. And you have basically the idea is, and it becomes fulfilled in that you really haven't eaten a meal unless you've had this core carbohydrate. Other places it might be a tortilla or a pasta or something like that, but that the meal itself is based around this central food. And I remember meeting my father-in-law for the first time, and you could go out with him and you could eat a few cheeseburgers, but if you didn't come back and eat some rice, then you hadn't even eaten yet. You hadn't had food. It wasn't like the same thing. Now you can see here that on the edges of the rice, or on the edges of the core carbohydrate, you have different things, often a bean, some form of protein, maybe a little bit of meat, something that's like spicy or sweet or salty. And one of the things that Mintz argues those things help you do is, if you eat a little bit of that, a little butter, maybe, then you can eat more potatoes. So you have just a little bit of meat or a little bit of something, and it helps you eat more of the core. So the sauce that goes on the pasta, it gives it that flavor, because without it, you can't eat just a whole bowl of pasta without anything on it. You need a little something. And so again, oftentimes, for example, in Korean meals, would give you a bowl of rice at the table, and then you're picking off little things from the center of the table, and then you're eating some rice with that, and then it tastes good together. So again, this tends to be a pattern in some of the major food areas of the world where you develop a dependence upon or a concentration on one of these core carbohydrates. Now, there can be a problem with this, that if something happens to your core carbohydrate, what do we know about what happens to these poor farmers? Famine, right? So let's say your rice crop fails or your potatoes go under or something, you can, if you become too dependent on one thing, it's not the best. In fact, Amanda, has this ever happened before in human history? Famines? Oh yeah, the potato famine. Yeah, that was a big one. And I think you had a quote from a long time ago. Person I'm actually going to talk about in my next class. When famine strikes Egypt. Yeah, from Ibn Battuta, right? Egypt's still important to us, but yeah, it's that when famine strikes Egypt, the world itself. So there was the grain hub of the world. When famine strikes Egypt, the world itself cannot feed her people. And so again, this is back when Egypt was the breadbasket for that part of the world. It was a serious issue. And the other thing that happens is since there's only a small part of the world that can be put, the way you try to deal with some of these issues of intensification is by irrigation, but that can sometimes lead to soil problems. They talk later about salinization. So if you irrigate the land without draining it correctly or well, it can result in an increase in salt or some agricultural practices can result in erosion, as we saw in the Dust Bowl in our own country, for example. I would say, though, that the biggest problem is not that these problems didn't exist before, say, 200 or 300 years ago. Obviously, they did. However, our largest famines and our worst cases of salinization and erosion have actually happened in the last 100 years or so. And so they happen with industrial agriculture and various state measures, which we're going to talk about more in the next class. For the most part, the people who are doing this intensive agriculture, well, Simi, who for the most part does this intensive agriculture? It's not the people with the gigantic industrial combines. Who's doing most of this? What do we call them? Yeah, the smallholding farmers. So, yeah, basically what some people call peasants. So they talk about peasants here a little bit, but peasants is just a funny word for people who are basically small farmers. But when we use the word peasants live, what do we think about? What do we think about those peasants? Do you want to be a peasant? Lower class. Yeah, it's generally kind of something, it's generally seen as something you don't want to be, right? If you're in an urban place and you're getting a college education, yeah, people don't like the peasants. Peasants are also sometimes connected to the idea of being in serf times in medieval Europe. So one of my professor friends came to this country and they were going on a road trip and there was a small farm and she said, you have there's some really pretty peasants that you have in this country. And they're like, no, we don't call them that. We call them farmers. We call them small farmers. But what I will say about this is that peasants or small farmers have been responsible for the bulk of the world's agricultural production. That is to say, if you look back and what's going on in the world, how long has this been around? How long has these small farmers been supporting people? Pretty much as long as agriculture. Since the time of, say, empires and cities, there's been this interaction to have urban life and to have some of those civilizations and early civilizations and empires they're often supported by peasant or small farmer agriculture. I'm going to say 7,000 years ago. I'll give it a number. Anyway, the point is that since people started digging and intensifying their agriculture, this has been the rule. Even today, even in today's world, it's actually surprising how many places are quite dependent on smallholding farms and agriculture. You gave us some numbers from Egypt. You don't have to remember the numbers, but you were surprised by how big it was. It was more than half in 2022. Egypt is a very large and urban country with over 100 million people. The idea that over half of them have involvement in agriculture, crazy. And then I think you gave a number for India, which was like 44%, which is, yeah, it's still not considering there's a billion people there. It's a lot of people. So it's a pretty big thing even today. Now, this is surprising for some people. I think it's surprising for me. How do we still have small farmers, or how do we still have peasants? And I'd like to draw from a book, one of the greatest books that nobody reads anymore and probably never read when it came out, but I really like it, called Peasants and Capital, Dominica and the World Economy by Michel Trouillot. And Trouillot was an anthropologist, and he went to Dominica, which is a very small island in the Caribbean, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, which is on the other side of Hispaniola or east of Haiti. But Dominica is a very small island that had been basically at one point colonized and through enslaved African labor devoted to sugar cane plantations. And what Trouillot discovered when he went there is that the formerly enslaved people had been able to, once they got freedom, they basically were able to take these large scale industrial style plantations and break them up into small holdings. And that the people he saw, they maintained they were, as I said, they were totally enmeshed in the global economy. They were not isolated from it. And in fact, almost everything they grew for sale, the bananas they grew for sale, they had to go down and sell it to this transnational company from the UK, and they would take these bananas to Europe. And so in some ways, it was like people here are completely part of this global system. It's not like they're off on their own being medieval peasants or serfs. And what he said was, even though most of this production, even though it was for a large multinational, which was controlling the trade of it, most of it was on these small farm units, which you might, if you just looked at them, call peasant. They looked very much like peasant farms. So Trouillot was trying to figure out, like, what is the deal? How is it that we have peasant production? And what he talked about is that what we need to figure out is what he called the peasant labor process. And I think this is in general applicable to the things that we have been talking about in terms of foraging, in terms of horticulture, in terms of pastoralism, that we see these not necessarily as identities, as things that are for all time, but as things that people participate in as a labor process and perhaps move in and out of and combine with other labor processes. For the peasant labor process, what he said was that often focuses, or it's often done by a family or a household or domestic unit, that they are doing agriculture. So it's involving planting, the stuff that we've been talking about, and it's usually on land that they own themselves. So oftentimes when we talk about a family farm, it's a domestic unit, a family. They have their house in the middle of the farm, or they're at least able to access their land. We'll talk about the sharecropping in a bit, but I just want to put this here, that this doesn't necessarily imply absolute ownership. It can be having rights to it or access to it, but you need to have access to the land. He also says that they often, or most often, they also bring their own tools with them. So they own the tools, or they own the means of production. They are not simply working for somebody else who has the own means of production. They're bringing their own tools, but it's usually that their tool energy is less than human labor energy. That is to say, most of the productive labor on a peasant or a small family farm is from doing it your human self. So you may have a tractor and you might have technology involved, but for the most part, most of the labor that you do is going to be the human part is more important. Now, there were a couple of questions that came up in the text about exactly how you calculate this labor energy and tool energy and these kinds of things. I just wanted to talk about those for a second before we go back into sharecropping. One of the questions was about this sentence. Assessing the productivity of labor requires two measurements: what has been achieved energetically and what energy has been expended to gain it. And sometimes in this textbook, I feel like they make this effort to quantify things in a way that might be useful, but might not overly quantify, but overly formal. So in this case, what they're saying is that if you compare the horsepower of human power versus a tractor, basically, let's do the human power, that the human power is actually, in terms of effectiveness or efficiency, if you just measured the productivity of the labor, the human wins. But if you calculate how much it costs to like keep the tractor going versus how much it costs to keep the human going, shelter, food, reproductive costs, then the human is actually much more costly. Now, I think this is a little bit strange because humans, of course, do much more than labor. Their reproductive costs are not actually something you necessarily are calculating. That's just called being alive and doing things and maybe having some fun. So yeah, maybe it is costly to support a human being if you're only laboring, but for the small farmer, that's just part of life. It's important to do these calculations as long as you don't get too enmeshed in them. Another question came from this wonderful calculation. In the United States, only 10% of the country's total time, the population times 24 times 365 is allocated to work. So if you get the population and then you times that by 24 hours in a day and 365 days in a year, then that's how much you have as your total time. And apparently we're only working 10% of that. So I don't know what people are complaining about when they say they're working hard. You're only working 10%. We're not working hard at all. No, I find this calculation is fair. Just multiply the population times 24 hours times 365. Turns out, yeah, I have it easy, man. 10% of my time. I don't know why people are complaining. I mean, next time somebody tells you they're busy, you just tell them, hey, you're only doing 10% of the total time allocated to work. Why are you shaking your head? It's what about sleep? Exactly. That was my first point. What about sleep? Like, are you trying to tell me so the total time should not include sleep? That's not part of the thing. We all have to sleep. I think this should at most be multiplied by 16, not 24. You have to sleep. And what about eating? You shouldn't really include that in your total time. Plus the population. Are we talking about babies too? What the hell? At least give people a chance to grow. Those lazy babies, they're hardly allocating any of their time to work. No wonder they're so terrible. The lazy babies. Exactly. Take them off. Yeah, cut them loose. Make them work harder. I mean, it should at least be the working age population, say age 18 to 65. Plus, like, are you really trying to tell me we should work 365 days? Anyway, the point of the matter is that you just have to, this calculation is fine. They're comparing it to Burundi, where they have to work 25% of the nation's total time. This is true. I mean, you also have to just take these numbers with a grain of salt. I like better just the idea that for small farmers, the human labor, one of the reasons you can know what they are is basically that you're going to see more human labor than you are going to see the use of fossil fuel powered machines in general. So I said we were talking a little bit about sharecropping. We usually associate sharecropping with that time after the Civil War in the United States. Farmers were basically, yeah, in some ways it's associated with a system of exploitation where people are trying to farm land that they don't own. And then I would say that sharecropping as a system does, as they say here, it does tend to reward the landowner because the landowner doesn't have to do anything. Somebody comes and like rents their land and they get a share, and then but they don't really have to participate in the same risk. Now, like I said, I think that's generally true. I would also like to point out here that sharecropping as a system can be a way of sharing risk in different places. So in where I studied in Colombia in Latin America, a lot of the people who were farming would do something that amounted to sharecropping, but it like this, where the landowner provided the land and the person who was going to farm it provided the seed and the labor and those things. And then at the end of the deal, they split the profits from this. So in some ways, yeah, it does still reward the landowner, but it wasn't actually a form of rent, because if you didn't make anything, then the landowner wasn't going to make anything either. I mentioned in the last slide that actually, although again, sharecropping gets a bad rap, is that it probably was a way in which some of these large plantations, the large land holdings were broken up, as the people would start farming part of this land, and over time, they would be able to acquire some land of their own. Not always, but it was. I mentioned that in my own research, they used this phrase which was called medias, which literally meant sharing, that we were going in halves on something. And this could be a relationship between people. And the classic one, of course, is the person who owned the land and the person who was going to plant the land. But it could also be a relationship between two people who were planting together and they had gone in basically halves, or they would say medias, or you could go in together on raising an animal. I went, and during my field work, went in on medias on raising a pig with someone that was living there. And then at the end, we split the profits from raising this pig, which turned out to be no big profits. So nobody wanted to go on medias with me anymore because I was unlucky at raising pigs. But it can be a way of sharing risk, or in an agricultural economy, it can be a general way of distributing the risks and rewards of agriculture. Again, I don't want to be too excited about it, because often it does, the landowners and inequality tend to eat up the profits of it. Now, one of the things that is people always assume that peasants or small farmers are going away, that they're disappearing. I would say that, as your book says, that peasant demise definitely happens. There are definitely times that people are small farming and then somebody comes in and is industrial farming and selling milk or fruit at a much cheaper price because they can make it on a larger scale, and it simply puts all the people out of business. In fact, this area around here used to have a lot of agricultural small farm production, and with the advent of railroads and other forms of transportation, people got their milk from other places. And so a lot of the dairy, for example, in this area, or the hops production was eliminated. What they say here, though, is that is not necessarily inevitable. It has occurred in many places, but it is not an inevitable scenario. And at least in my view, is that, interestingly, although peasants often disappear or small farmers often disappear, they often keep popping up, they reemerge. And so there are places that were once occupied by plantations, as we talked about, or places that once had industrial agriculture, and then they get turned back over, or the small farmers. There's something about, I don't know if inherent to humans, I think that would be too much, but to say, but there is something that people often like to dig, and they like to dig up the land and plant things, go back there after they've done different things in their life. Now, this happens in places where agriculture is often unsupported. And so in many of, for example, the Caribbean areas where there was sugarcane, there was almost no support for peasant agriculture, for small farms, and yet people were able to make them. Or in places where people are looked down upon, overtaxed, even oppressed, people seem to really cling to and find refuge in small farming. I would say that people have always hated working on the farm, and they've moved away from this. From the time there were small farms, people have probably tried to leave the small farm and go to the city and do something else. And I think this has probably been a big, like I said, probably for hundreds or maybe even thousands of years. If you grew up on a farm, if you grew up part of a farm family, you didn't want to be milking those cows, or you didn't want to be planting that stuff. The first thing you wanted to do was move away because you hated it. But the thing is, people often gravitate back, or some people stay, or different people find ways to survive. And so what is curious is that, like I said, something about being on your own plot of land and owning something and doing some form of agriculture, growing things, growing plants, tending to animals, continues to be important to people, and it can be mixed in with living in a cash economy, or even selling to, in the case of the banana growers, selling to a transnational corporation. There was an interesting example in the book, the Kofiar, who talk about the importance of their ancestral homelands. And on the one hand, they've built, I think, Amanda, they've built roads back and forth and vacation homes, and a lot of them have urban educations and all kinds of technology and stuff like that, but they still do what they call cooperative work groups. And they said that they have increased in frequency. And so in some ways, people are actually using their modern connections in order to promote these, what we might call more traditional forms of labor. So it's interesting that in some ways, although small farmers our common idea is that they're always going away and disappearing and to all be gone, that they keep, I don't know, keep popping up. Is there any examples of that happening around here? Anybody know anything happening here in this Oneonta place? Liv, did your parents ever drag you down anywhere to see some farmers? Farmers at the farmers market? Yeah, you have to go into the foothills now. Yeah. I'm not sure. They're trying. They're doing their thing down there. You can go down and see the Oneonta Farmers Market every Saturday. Foothills, or the Foothills parking lot. So this is one thing that is actually quite common, or has become more prominent, bless you, in different towns and different places across the country, is trying to establish this more direct relationship between the farmers and the people who buy things from them. Another aspect of this that has happened around here is what is called community supported agriculture. And so these community support comes and goes. They pop up and then people discover it's too much work. But the idea is you buy a share of the farm produce and you participate in the farm, and then you get a weekly delivery of vegetables or products from the farm. And one of the big ones around here, I think, is what's called the 607 for our area code, the 607 CSA, which sees itself trying to invigorate the sustainability and food sovereignty of our area. even in our short growing season. So I don't know. Been a member of this sometimes over the years. Might have to sign up again, help them out. But if you go there now to their website, they're like, this is not an online grocer. This is a membership. You have to participate in it. Sometimes the crops are going to fail and you just have to deal with it. They might not look good because people get all weirded out. So I think this reminded me of, I showed you the film or part of the film, The Maasai Women, which was part of a series called Disappearing World. And it reminded me of this sentence that everywhere we have mass education, global cultural expectations, mobile phones, television, and other social media. And I think it is true. And it was striking to me when we watch a film like Maasai Women, you see people living in a world in which everyone wasn't looking at their phones all the time. I don't know. It's just of interest to me to see a world like that, because in fact, wherever you go in the world today, and they've talked about various societies, including hunters and gatherers and people in the Arctic and all over the place, is people are going to have their phones or their snowmobiles or those kinds of things. And for many anthropologists, you might notice in this textbook, there's sometimes a wistful tone, like that the world is all different now. But it does bring up a big question for anthropologists when they look back at, say, studying people from 50 years ago. And we see in the last chapter, for example, the lead author here, Daniel Bates, talks about his experiences when he was there in 1972 versus today, and how, how they're completely integrated into the world economy. But it brings up a good question for the kinds of studies. Were the people that you were studying back in the day, were they really so different, culturally speaking? Or was it simply a function of their unequal relationship and unequal integration into the world economy? So it's always something to keep in mind when you think about these older studies and when we think about today's world. I will say, though, that what's also surprising is how much these groups that we thought were going to disappear have adapted and continued to do their thing. In this case, this is a story of them the Maasai today, trying to retain rights to their land. The Tanzanian government apparently is trying to put in a big tourist place where you can go and stay and do luxury game hunting. And so this is a fight for their lands. In some ways, it's still, to me at least, it indicates that there's people in today's world who think that it is important to have this identity and to have this land and to try and continue these practices. And as much as has changed in the world, there is still this sense of trying to recapture or preserve and even in some cases expand the traditional variety.